The first light came not from the sun but from a single candle in a window in Florence on a morning in 1453, placed there by a widow who had decided that morning was the day she would stop being afraid. She had lived through plague and famine, through war and upheaval, through the death of nearly everyone she had known in childhood. She had survived when survival seemed impossible, had endured when endurance seemed pointless, and on that particular morning, for reasons she could not have explained even to herself, she woke with the certainty that something had shifted, that the long darkness humanity had been moving through was beginning finally to give way to something else. She lit her candle and placed it in her window, and across the street, her neighbor saw it and understood and lit a candle of his own. By evening, a dozen windows glowed in that street, and within a week, the custom had spread through the quarter. It was a small thing, candles and windows, but it marked something larger, a turning, a decision to believe that light was possible again, that humanity might create beauty and meaning rather than simply surviving from one catastrophe to the next. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The centuries that followed the medieval period's catastrophes, the plagues, famines, and endless wars that had devastated Europe, saw humanity awakening to new possibilities. This was not a sudden transformation, not a single moment when darkness gave way to light, but rather a gradual brightening that took place over generations. It was an awakening in the truest sense, a slow emergence from nightmare into a world where hope seemed possible again, where creativity and inquiry and beauty could flourish alongside the eternal human struggles of survival and power. History would later call this period the Renaissance, the rebirth, and that name captured something essential about what was happening. But it was not simply a rebirth of classical learning and culture, though that was part of it. It was also a birth of something new, a flowering of human potential that had been constrained by the particular circumstances of medieval life, by rigid hierarchies, by the church's monopoly on truth, by economic systems that left most people focused purely on survival, by the sheer weight of catastrophe that had made hope seem foolish. The transformation began in Italy, in the wealthy city-states that had maintained trade connections throughout the medieval period and had accumulated capital that could be invested in more than mere survival. Florence, Venice, Milan, Rome. These cities became laboratories where new ideas about art, architecture, politics, and human nature could be explored. They were not democracies in any modern sense, often ruled by wealthy families or merchant oligarchies. But they were places where money could buy influence regardless of birth, where talent could find patronage, where ideas could circulate relatively freely. The wealth that made this cultural flowering possible came from trade, from banking, from the manufacture of luxury goods like silk and fine woolens. The Italian cities sat at the intersection of trade routes, connecting northern Europe with the Mediterranean and beyond, to the Islamic world and the riches of Asia. They had survived the catastrophes of the 14th century better than many regions, and by the 15th century, they were prospering in ways that created surplus wealth, surplus time, surplus energy that could be directed towards something beyond mere survival. This prosperity was not evenly distributed. The wealth that funded Renaissance art and learning was concentrated in the hands of a relatively small elite. Merchant families like the Medici in Florence, aristocratic families, successful bankers and traders. The vast majority of people remained poor, working in agriculture or urban crafts, living lives that were not dramatically different from their medieval ancestors. But the existence of a wealthy class with cultural ambitions created opportunities that had not existed before. Patronage became the key mechanism through which Renaissance culture developed. Wealthy individuals and families competed to sponsor artists, architects, scholars, and poets, both from genuine appreciation of beauty and learning and from desire for prestige and immortality through association with great works. A merchant prince might commission a chapel decorated by the finest artists ensuring that his name would be remembered alongside theirs. A duke might maintain a court of poets and philosophers, demonstrating his sophistication and cultivating his reputation. This patronage system had its problems. Artists and scholars depended on pleasing their patrons, which could constrain their work. But it also freed them from having to survive through their art alone, giving them resources and time to develop their craft. An artist supported by a wealthy patron could spend years perfecting a single work, experimenting with techniques, pursuing visions that might have no immediate commercial value. A scholar could devote himself to translation and commentary, preserving and extending classical learning. The rediscovery of classical texts was one of the catalysts for the Renaissance transformation. Throughout the medieval period, much of ancient Greek and Roman literature had been lost to Western Europe, preserved only in Islamic libraries or Byzantine monasteries. What was known came through Latin translations, often incomplete or corrupted through repeated copying. Beginning in the 14th century and accelerating in the 15th, scholars began recovering original texts, translating them directly from Greek, discovering works that had been unknown for centuries. This recovery of the classical past revealed to Europeans that their ancestors had achieved remarkable things, that ancient Athens and Rome had produced philosophy, literature, art, and architecture of extraordinary sophistication. But more importantly, it demonstrated that human beings were capable of greatness without divine revelation, that reason and observation could lead to profound understanding, that earthly life could be beautiful and meaningful in itself, rather than merely preparation for the afterlife. The classical texts offered models for thinking about politics, ethics, nature, and art that were different from medieval Christian frameworks. Plato and Aristotle had developed philosophical systems based on reason rather than revelation. Roman historians like Livy and Tacitus had analyzed political systems and human nature without reference to divine providence. Ancient poets like Virgil and Ovid had celebrated earthly love and beauty as worthy subjects in themselves. This did not immediately or completely undermine Christian belief. Many Renaissance figures remained sincerely religious, seeing no contradiction between Christian faith and classical learning. They sought to synthesize the two to show how ancient wisdom could complement Christian truth. But the availability of alternative frameworks for understanding the world did gradually erode the Church's monopoly on truth and authority. If the ancients could achieve wisdom without Christianity, if reason could lead to profound insights, then perhaps human beings had capacities and value independent of their relationship to the divine. Humanism emerged as an intellectual movement centered on these ideas. Humanists emphasized the dignity and potential of human beings, the value of education and eloquence, the importance of engaging with the world rather than withdrawing from it. They studied classical texts not just for their content, but for their style, seeing in Cicero's prose and Virgil's poetry models of expression that could elevate human communication. They believed that through education, through studying language, literature, history, and philosophy, human beings could realize their potential and contribute to the common good. This humanist emphasis on education and individual development had significant social implications. If human potential could be developed through learning rather than being fixed by birth or divine election, then education became crucial. Humanist educators developed new pedagogical approaches emphasizing classical languages, rhetoric, and moral philosophy. Schools and universities adapted their curricula to include these subjects. The ideal of the Renaissance man, someone educated in arts and sciences, capable in multiple domains, reflected this belief that human beings could and should cultivate their capacities broadly. Art underwent revolutionary transformations during this period, developing techniques and approaches that would define Western art for centuries. Medieval art had been primarily religious in subject matter and symbolic in approach, using flat compositions and hierarchical scale to convey spiritual truths. Renaissance artists, while often still working on religious subjects, brought new ambitions to their work. They wanted to represent the visible world accurately, to capture three-dimensional space on two-dimensional surfaces, to depict human figures with anatomical precision and emotional depth. The development of linear perspective was one of the great technical achievements that enabled this transformation. Artists and architects working in early 15th century Florence discovered mathematical principles for representing three-dimensional space consistently on flat surfaces. By establishing a vanishing point and organizing all lines in the composition to converge on it, they could create convincing illusions of depth and space. This technique, once discovered, spread rapidly and became foundational to Western art. But perspective was more than just a technical trick. It reflected a broader shift in how people understood their relationship to the world. Perspective assumes a single viewing point, a specific location in space from which the scene is observed. This implicitly elevated the individual observer, making human perception the organizing principle around which the visual world was arranged. It was a subtle assertion of human importance and agency that resonated with broader humanist ideas. Artists also began studying anatomy systematically, dissecting corpses to understand the structure of muscles and bones, learning how bodies moved and how they should be represented. This pursuit of knowledge through direct observation rather than relying on traditional authorities reflected the period's growing empiricism. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci filled notebooks with anatomical drawings of extraordinary precision, treating art and science as complementary ways of understanding nature. The human body became a central subject of Renaissance art in ways it had not been in the medieval period. Nude figures appeared not just in religious contexts, but as celebrations of human beauty and form. Sculptures of idealized human bodies, like Michelangelo's David, proclaimed human dignity and power. Paintings depicted not just souls awaiting judgment, but human beings in all their physical presence and emotional complexity. Portraiture emerged as a major genre, reflecting growing interest in individual identity and achievement. Where medieval art had depicted generic types, the saint, the king, the peasant, Renaissance portraits captured specific individuals with their distinctive features and personalities. A portrait was a claim to importance, an assertion that this particular person's existence mattered enough to be recorded. The rise of portraiture both reflected and reinforced growing emphasis on individual identity and achievement. Architecture similarly underwent transformation, moving from the soaring verticality of Gothic cathedrals toward forms inspired by classical Roman buildings. Renaissance architects studied ancient ruins, measuring and analyzing their proportions, seeking to understand the principles that made them beautiful. They applied these principles to new buildings, churches, palaces, public structures, creating compositions that emphasized harmony, balance, and human scale. The architect Filippo Brunelleschi designed the dome of Florence Cathedral, solving engineering problems that had stymied builders for decades and creating a structure that dominated the city's skyline, a testament to human ingenuity and ambition. Leon Battista Alberti wrote treatises codifying architectural principles based on mathematical proportion and classical precedent. Andrea Palladio designed villas and churches that would influence architecture worldwide for centuries. These buildings were not just functional structures, but statements about human capacity to create beauty and order, to shape the environment according to rational principles. They reflected confidence in human reason and ability that contrasted with medieval emphasis on divine mystery and human limitation. A Renaissance palazzo proclaimed its owner's wealth and taste, certainly, but also made broader claims about humanity's place in the world. Literature flourished in both Latin and increasingly in vernacular languages. Dante's Divine Comedy, written in Italian in the early 14th century, had demonstrated that vernacular languages could achieve literary heights previously reserved for Latin. Petrarch's poetry in Italian established him as one of the great lyric poets. Boccaccio's Decameron showed that vernacular prose could be both entertaining and morally sophisticated. By the 15th and 16th centuries, vernacular literatures were flourishing across Europe. In England, Chaucer had written the Canterbury Tales in Middle English. In France, François Rabelais wrote satirical novels that pushed boundaries of acceptable content. In Spain, writers developed forms that would evolve into the novel. The use of vernacular languages made literature accessible to broader audiences and validated those languages as worthy vehicles for serious thought and art. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, revolutionized the production and distribution of texts. Before printing, books were copied by hand, making them expensive and rare. A monastery's library might contain a few dozen volumes. A wealthy individual might own a handful. The printing press made it possible to produce hundreds or thousands of identical copies of a text relatively quickly and cheaply. The impact of printing cannot be overstated. It democratized access to knowledge, making books available to middle-class readers who could never have afforded manuscripts. It standardized texts, ensuring that readers in different locations could consult identical versions rather than variants introduced through copying errors. It accelerated the spread of ideas, allowing new discoveries or arguments to reach wide audiences rapidly. And it undermined authorities who had controlled access to texts, making censorship more difficult and enabling challenges to established doctrines. The first major work printed was the Bible, and religious texts remained important products of the printing industry. But the press also disseminated classical works, humanist treatises, scientific texts, and eventually popular literature and news. Within decades of Gutenberg's innovation, printing presses had been established in every major European city, churning out thousands of titles. By 1500, perhaps 20 million volumes had been printed, more books than had existed in all of Europe before the printing press. This explosion of available texts transformed learning and culture. Scholars who previously had to travel to distant libraries to consult rare manuscripts could now own copies of important works. Students could study from standardized textbooks. Ideas could spread across Europe in months rather than decades. The printing press created an information revolution that reshaped society as profoundly as the internet would in our own time. Music also developed new complexity and expressiveness during the Renaissance. Polyphony, music with multiple independent melodic lines, became increasingly sophisticated. Composers like Josquin des Prez created masses and motets that wove multiple voices together in intricate patterns. Secular music flourished alongside sacred, with madrigals and chansons exploring themes of love and nature. Musical notation became more precise, allowing complex compositions to be written down and performed by musicians who had never heard them. The development of new instruments and improvements to existing ones expanded the sonic palette available to composers. The lute became a popular instrument for both solo performance and accompaniment. Keyboard instruments evolved toward what would become the piano. Ensembles combined voices and instruments in new ways, creating rich textures. Music became an important part of court culture, with wealthy patrons maintaining musicians and composers just as they patronized visual artists and poets. Science and natural philosophy began to develop approaches that would eventually lead to the scientific revolution of the 17th century. This was not yet modern science. The experimental method was still being developed. Mathematics had not yet been fully integrated with physical observation, and many ideas that seem obviously wrong to us were taken seriously. But the Renaissance saw important shifts in how people thought about investigating nature. Direct observation became more valued as a source of knowledge. Rather than simply consulting ancient authorities or reasoning from first principles, scholars increasingly emphasized looking at the world carefully and recording what they saw. Anatomists dissected bodies. Botanists created detailed drawings of plants. Astronomers made precise observations of celestial movements. This empirical turn, while not fully developed, represented an important shift toward grounding knowledge in evidence. Mathematics gained new importance as a tool for understanding nature. Perspective in art required geometric knowledge. Architecture relied on mathematical proportion. Astronomy involved complex calculations. Natural philosophers increasingly sought to express natural laws in mathematical terms, believing that beneath the apparent complexity of nature lay simple mathematical relationships. This conviction that nature operated according to mathematical principles would become foundational to modern science. Technology also advanced, though often through practical innovation by craftsmen rather than application of theoretical knowledge. Improvements in metallurgy allowed better weapons and tools. Advances in shipbuilding and navigation enabled the age of exploration that would begin in the late 15th century. Mechanical clocks became more accurate and widespread, changing how people understood and measured time. The printing press itself was a technological marvel, combining several existing technologies in a new way. The voyages of exploration that began in the late 15th century would have profound effects on European society and the world. Portuguese sailors pushed down the African coast, eventually reaching India by sea and establishing trade routes that bypassed Islamic middlemen. Spanish expeditions seeking a western route to Asia instead encountered the Americas, continents whose existence had been unknown to Europeans. These discoveries shattered existing geographical understanding and confronted Europeans with entirely new peoples, plants, animals, and possibilities. The conquest and colonization that followed would bring immense wealth to European powers, particularly Spain, but at catastrophic cost to indigenous populations who faced disease, enslavement, and violence. The ethical implications of these encounters were debated even at the time, though profit and power generally won out over moral qualms. The silver and gold extracted from the Americas flooded into Europe, disrupting economies and helping to fund the cultural and military activities of Renaissance states. The encounter with previously unknown civilizations challenged European assumptions about human nature and history. And the Columbian exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the eastern and western hemispheres, would reshape the world in ways that are still unfolding. Political thought also underwent significant development during the Renaissance. The Italian city-states, with their complex political dynamics and frequent upheavals, became laboratories for thinking about power, governance, and statecraft. Niccolò Machiavelli, a Florentine diplomat and political theorist, wrote The Prince, a treatise on political power that stripped away moral pretensions to analyze how rulers actually gained and maintained power. Machiavelli's work was shocking to many readers because of its amorality. It described what worked politically without necessarily endorsing it morally, but it represented a new kind of political thinking, one based on observation of how politics actually functioned, rather than how it ideally should function. This realist approach influenced political thought for centuries and reflected broader Renaissance emphasis on engaging with the world as it was, rather than as authorities said it should be. Other political thinkers developed different approaches. Thomas More's Utopia imagined an ideal society on a distant island, using the fiction to critique contemporary European politics and social arrangements. Jean Bodin theorized about sovereignty and the foundations of political authority. These varied approaches shared a willingness to think critically about political systems, to question traditional arrangements, to imagine alternatives. The nation-state began to emerge as the dominant form of political organization during this period, gradually replacing the feudal patchwork of overlapping authorities that had characterized medieval Europe. Monarchs consolidated power, building bureaucracies and armies, extending their control over territories that had been effectively autonomous. The idea of sovereignty, that a single authority held supreme power within a defined territory, gained currency, providing a framework for thinking about political organization. This consolidation of state power had mixed implications. Strong states could provide order, enforce laws, defend against external threats, but they also had greater capacity for oppression, for demanding taxes and military service, for imposing uniformity. The relationship between state power and individual liberty would become one of the central political questions of subsequent centuries. Religion remained central to Renaissance life, even as humanist emphasis on earthly existence and classical learning created some tension with traditional Christian worldviews. The Catholic Church was immensely wealthy and powerful, owning vast lands, collecting tithes and fees, maintaining elaborate hierarchies. The Pope ruled as a temporal prince over the Papal States in central Italy, in addition to his spiritual authority over Christians across Europe. But the Church also faced challenges. Its wealth and worldliness prompted criticism from those who felt it had strayed from Christian simplicity and devotion. Corruption was rampant. Church offices were bought and sold. Clergy lived in luxury while preaching poverty. Indulgences were sold as tickets to heaven. Attempts at reform had limited success, and discontent simmered among both ordinary believers and some clergy. The humanist emphasis on returning to original sources applied to Christianity, as well as classical texts. Scholars like Erasmus studied the Bible in original Greek and Hebrew, producing new translations and commentaries that sometimes challenged traditional interpretations. This created the potential for questioning church teachings by appealing to Scripture directly rather than accepting ecclesiastical authority. The Protestant Reformation, which began when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517, shattered Christian unity in Western Europe. Luther challenged the sale of indulgences and other church practices, arguing that salvation came through faith alone, rather than through works or church mediation. When the church tried to suppress his teachings, he refused to recant, and his ideas spread rapidly through printing and preaching. The Reformation was not simply a theological dispute, but had deep social and political dimensions. Many German princes supported Luther partly from genuine religious conviction, but also because breaking with Rome allowed them to seize church property and assert independence from papal authority. Urban populations and emerging middle classes often embraced Protestantism, which emphasized individual relationship with God and reading scripture personally, rather than depending on priestly mediation. The Reformation fragmented Christianity into competing denominations: Lutherans, Calvinists, Anglicans, Anabaptists, and others, each claiming to represent true Christian teaching. This led to religious wars that devastated Europe for more than a century. But it also created the possibility of religious diversity, the idea that different Christian groups might coexist, rather than one universal church enforcing orthodoxy. The long-term implications would include greater tolerance and eventually the idea that individuals might choose their religious beliefs. The Catholic Church responded with its own Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, which addressed some of the worst abuses while reaffirming traditional doctrines and strengthening institutional structure. New religious orders like the Jesuits combined strict discipline with educational and missionary work, becoming powerful agents of Catholic renewal. The Council of Trent clarified Catholic theology and reformed church practices. The result was a more disciplined, more militant Catholicism that could compete with Protestant churches. Social life during the Renaissance varied enormously by class, location, and period. For the wealthy elite who patronized arts and learning, life could be comfortable and culturally rich. They lived in well-appointed palaces or country estates, ate varied diets including meat and imported luxuries like spices and sugar, wore fine clothing made from silk and wool, and had access to education and entertainment. They employed numerous servants who handled domestic work, leaving them free for leisure, business, and cultural pursuits. The middle classes, successful merchants, guild masters, professionals like lawyers and doctors, enjoyed increasing prosperity and social status. They could afford comfortable homes, adequate food and clothing, some luxuries and cultural participation. Their children could receive education, and ambitious families might hope to rise into the ranks of the elite through success in business or marriage. The Renaissance saw expansion of this middle class, creating a larger audience for culture and a more dynamic social structure. For ordinary people, urban workers, rural peasants, life remained hard and precarious. Most worked long hours at physically demanding labor, earning barely enough to support their families. Their diets were monotonous, based on bread and vegetables with meat rarely. They lived in small, crowded dwellings with minimal furnishings. Literacy remained relatively rare among this class, though it was increasing, especially in cities. Their participation in Renaissance culture was mostly indirect, through church art and festivals rather than through books or commissioned artworks. Women's lives were constrained by patriarchal assumptions and laws that subordinated them to fathers and husbands. Elite women might receive some education and could exercise influence through informal channels, but they were generally excluded from public life and most occupations. Middle-class women often worked in family businesses or practiced trades, particularly after widowhood. Poor women worked as servants, in textile production or in agriculture, combining wage labor with household responsibilities. Yet within these constraints, women found ways to exercise agency and creativity. Some became patrons of arts and learning, others wrote poetry or religious works. A few achieved recognition as artists or scholars, though they faced significant barriers. Convents provided spaces where women could pursue learning and spiritual life with some independence from male authority. The full flowering of women's potential would require centuries more of struggle, but Renaissance women were not entirely powerless or passive. Family structures remained patriarchal, with fathers holding formal authority over wives and children. Marriages were often arranged by families for economic or political advantage. Though affection between spouses was considered desirable, Family size varied. Wealthy families might have fewer children, spacing births to preserve inheritance, while poorer families often had many children, though mortality rates were high. Childhood was not the protected phase we consider it today. Children began working at young ages, contributing to household economies. Elite children received formal education, learning Latin, rhetoric, and classical texts, while most children learned through apprenticeship or informal instruction. The concept of childhood as a distinct life stage requiring special protection and nurturing was only beginning to develop. Daily life followed rhythms set by agricultural cycles for rural populations and by work schedules for urban dwellers. The vast majority of people lived in the countryside, farming land they owned or rented. City populations were growing, creating urban centers of tens or hundreds of thousands. But Europe remained predominantly agricultural. Most goods were produced locally by artisans and craftspeople, though long-distance trade in luxuries and some bulk goods was significant. Entertainment ranged from popular festivals and religious celebrations to elite courtly entertainments. Common people enjoyed festivals marking agricultural seasons and religious holidays, featuring music, dancing, drinking, and games. Cities had taverns and spaces for socializing. Elite courts hosted elaborate entertainments, masques, ballets, dramatic performances that combined music, poetry, and spectacle. Sanitation and public health remained primitive by modern standards. Cities had rudimentary sewage systems at best, with waste often dumped in streets or rivers. Water supplies were frequently contaminated. These conditions facilitated disease transmission, and periodic plague outbreaks continued through the 16th and 17th centuries, though never reaching the catastrophic levels of the 14th century Black Death. Medicine remained a mixture of classical theories, folk practices, and gradual empirical learning. The theory of bodily humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, guided treatment, which often involved purging, bleeding, or balancing supposedly imbalanced humors. Surgical techniques slowly improved, though without anesthesia or antiseptics, surgery remained dangerous and agonizing. Herbal remedies had some efficacy, though understanding of why they worked was limited. Life expectancy remained low by modern standards. Those who survived childhood might expect to live into their 50s or 60s. But childhood mortality was high, as was death in childbirth for women. Disease, accident, and violence claimed many lives. Yet people seem to accept this mortality more readily than we do, perhaps because they had no choice, perhaps because religious belief in an afterlife provided consolation. The Renaissance was neither as golden as celebratory accounts suggest, nor as limited as critical revisions claim. It was a period of remarkable cultural achievement that genuinely transformed European arts, learning, and thought. The works created by Renaissance artists and writers remain among humanity's greatest cultural treasures. The intellectual approaches developed by Renaissance humanists and natural philosophers laid groundwork for later scientific and philosophical developments. But this achievement coexisted with brutal inequality, religious persecution, frequent warfare, colonial violence, and most people living in poverty and hardship. The beauty created by Renaissance culture was funded by exploitation of labor and resources. The confidence in human reason and potential was often accompanied by arrogance and disregard for those deemed inferior. The period's achievements cannot be separated from its injustices. Perhaps most importantly, the Renaissance demonstrated that human societies are not static, that cultural and intellectual frameworks can change dramatically, that what seems permanent and natural in one era can be transformed in another. The transition from medieval to Renaissance worldviews showed that human beings could reimagine their place in the cosmos, their relationships to the divine and to each other, their purposes and possibilities. This capacity for transformation would prove crucial in subsequent centuries as European societies underwent further revolutions, scientific, political, industrial, social. The Renaissance was not the origin point for modernity, but it was an important early phase in the long, complex process by which modern worldviews emerged from medieval foundations. The awakening that the Renaissance represented was not complete, not universal, not uncomplicated. Many people were untouched by humanist learning and artistic innovation. Traditional beliefs and practices persisted alongside new ideas. The light that dawned was not pure or uniform, but filtered through countless local circumstances, creating patterns of illumination and shadow. Yet something had shifted. The confidence that human beings could understand and shape their world through reason and effort, the celebration of earthly beauty and human achievement, the questioning of traditional authorities, the expansion of knowledge through observation and discovery, these represented genuine changes in how Europeans thought about themselves and their place in the world. The candles in the windows of Florence, which began this story, were small gestures, but they marked a decision to hope, to create, to believe that light was possible. That decision, multiplied across countless individuals and communities, sustained through generations, led to extraordinary achievements and terrible failures, beauty and horror, progress and catastrophe. The Great Awakening that followed the medieval period's darkness was not a simple triumph of light over dark, but a complex, contradictory, ongoing process of human beings trying to understand themselves and their world, trying to create meaning and beauty, trying to build societies that balanced order with freedom, tradition with innovation, the individual with the community. That process continues still, in forms those Renaissance figures could not have imagined. But the questions they grappled with remain relevant. What does it mean to be human? What are we capable of achieving? How should we live? What kind of societies should we build? The answers they developed were limited by their historical circumstances, as ours are by ours. But their willingness to ask, to explore, to create, to think, that remains inspiring and instructive. The Great Awakening was not an ending but a beginning, not an arrival but a departure. It opened possibilities that would unfold over centuries, creating the modern world with all its achievements and problems. And it demonstrated that human beings, emerging from darkness, could choose to light candles, to create beauty, to pursue knowledge, to hope for something better. That choice, renewed in each generation, remains humanity's great challenge and greatest potential.